Good afternoon, everybody. Can I first of all just acknowledge Rob Rogers, Deputy Commissioner, New South Wales Rural Fire Service, Dave Haley, the Superintendent of New South Wales Rural Fire Service, Canoggles District, and Dave's team. Volunteers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real privilege to be here today. It's a bit like coming home, really. Oh, and Kel. I haven't seen Kel for years. Saw you in the front there, sorry. It's always a bit like coming home, having started in the RFS at the age of 19 or 20, and I won't tell you how old I am now, but I'll get there. But it's been a great journey, I suppose, and it's a privilege now to serve the Australian government in the context of emergency management. But I simply couldn't do it without all of the years in the RFS and all the colleagues that I worked with over the best part of 25 years. So, and working at the federal government's a bit of an interesting foray, because they're not necessarily attuned to the needs of volunteers or sort of, I guess, have the experience in the space of disasters that we perhaps would like them to have. But having said that, there is a lot of commitment back towards the industry and towards volunteers and the services more broadly. So I think there's been a meeting of the minds over the last few years about how we deal with this ongoing problem, which we'll talk a little bit about this morning. So I called the presentation Politics of Operations, and that'll be no surprise to RFS volunteers, about politics of operations. I think we've probably been blooded in that sport over the last 40 or 50 years or so. But there's been a few changes in the last 10 years, and I wanted to start with the Canberra fires. But before I do, it's a presentation I give up at the Institute of Police Management as well with some of the up-and-coming incident controllers and future commissioners, is to touch on some of these things that over the last 10 years we've seen a much greater influence of both elected officials and senior bureaucrats and governments in our business. There's no doubt about that. If you go back about 10 years, and I've got to say, probably picking up on Rob's point about your coordinated arrangements, I do think they are the best in the country, I've got to tell you. I think that having witnessed this summer the flood, fire, storm, tornado and whatever else has gone on, New South Wales performed exceptionally well. I've got to say, under very adverse circumstance. And I think you've probably almost got the balance right between your bureaucratic level, your political level and the service level. I really do. I think that manifested very positively this summer. That doesn't necessarily exist to the same level or the same standard, if you like, across the rest of Australia. And I won't comment too much about the specificity of that, but just to make the point, I think New South Wales has got a good balance. And the fact that you've got a commissioner that reports directly to a minister, I think is a good thing. And the reason I say that is in the last 10 years, we've seen Queensland Fire and Rescue Authority, the Emergency Services Authority in Canberra, the Fire and Emergency Services Authority in Western Australia, the CFA in Victoria, the MFB in Victoria, all of which were authorities which had statutory boards and independence, have all been brought back into government. There's not an authority left in Australia now. There's not a standalone agency that reports as a statutory authority directly to the government. So we've seen a big transition in 10 years, and there's been a couple of reasons for that. I think the whole of government were not taking enough interest in this business, and we were seeing large losses and large impacts, and government's not responding appropriately. But I think also the industry got a little bit, dare I say it, a little bit arrogant in some corners of the world, and a little bit special or different, and didn't see itself as part of government. And I think that was to play out over the last 10 years. So I think you've seen both of these things come to the fore. Governments realise they have to step up and step into this space in more substantial and supporting way, but also that the service has to, if you like, take a pill of humility occasionally and realise that it is part of a much bigger picture. So that's sort of, I guess, my reading of the last 10 years and where we've come to. So media is now better informed than it's ever been. We'll have a quick look at that. And this need for instant information and transparency just keeps going up and up and up. So look, I think the biggest challenge we face as volunteers and as emergency services more generally, and I've always said this for a number of years, we're actually in the business of trust and confidence. And the way we do that is by what we do through our volunteer efforts, through protecting our community. But when you put on the RFS uniform, whether it's your protective clothing or whether it's your dress uniform or whatever it is, there's a badge on your shoulder. And it's quite interesting in this country. We don't necessarily fully understand what that means, but in some countries overseas that means corruption, because when the uniforms walk in, the money's handed over. In some areas in the world it means death. When the uniform rolls into town, the women and children run for their lives. But in this country it means trust. It actually is a symbol of trust. And if someone puts on a uniform, then it's a very visual display in society about that you're asking to be trusted by people. And I found, and particularly, I guess my experience in Canberra, I found that people had forgotten about that. Emergency services had very much forgotten about that notion of why do you put the uniform on. And if anyone here's been ex-military or ex-police, you'd understand that when you put that thing on, you're actually asking people to trust you, not only trust you, but trust you in the face of adversity. So look, just a few things we'll touch on, and I'll use some examples through some of these things about some of these attributes. So vision, media, risk, failure, politics, and resilience. We may not get all the way through it. Look, I'll leave you with the slides as well, because some of these slides might be of interest to some, perhaps not to others. But we actually put we put a framework around trust. When I went to Canberra, one of the biggest things that was lost after the Canberra fires was the trust of the community. It was just extraordinary how angry that community was after that fire. And there's obviously a few reasons for that, and we'll have a look at that in a minute, but the trust just went out the window, I've got to say. Like the community was very angry, and emergency services struggled to walk down the street. They really did. They struggled to walk down the street. They felt so bad about what had happened, and they couldn't lift their heads up. And I don't know if any of you sort of witnessed the playing out of the coronial inquiry and the Supreme Court action with the coroner and the subsequent Supreme Court action between ACT, New South Wales and the private landowners. But it's been going on about 10 years, starting to roll up or wrap up. But some people are still really angry, and some people have a real, I guess, a projection towards the volunteer and career services, which is not healthy. So trust went out the window. When I got there, it was very obvious to me that was the thing that had to be rebuilt as quickly as possible, because it was still, until you were there before me, I think you'd resonate with this as well, that that struggle to get that trust back was a really, has been a long road, and it's still going. So look, I won't go through these in detail. We looked at trust from a relationship point of view and tried to engender some of those behaviours in our offices, but as I said, I'll leave that for another day because time's running on. But some of these attributes around behaviour we found were really important. So, talking straight is actually quite important. It's pretty easy for country people to talk straight, not so easy for city people. Righting wrongs, there were a lot of wrongs, I think, and they needed to be righted over time, and people needed to work through that. Extending trust, getting better was another one, I think, and confronting reality as well. And we'll talk about confronting reality also, I think, because often in this space we're not prepared to confront reality with what it is we're about to face or deal with. But anyway, it's just a touch on some of the behaviours we've tried to instill in the offices after that event. And then, of course, if you extend trust even further, you start to realise that if you've got an organisation that has low trust, it's going to cost you a lot of money. And there's a lot of procedure in low trust organisations, and a lot of governance, and a lot of paperwork. And the higher you can put trust in your organisation, the less you have of that sort of stuff. And that's a lesson for all organisations, I think. The more you can trust your people, the more efficient you become, the more effective things become. And often when organisations lose trust, and you'll see this after major fires or floods or storms or whatever, they get a swamp of bureaucracy comes in because the trust has been lost or it's been lost, and then people try and fix it up by putting in more bits and pieces. But hopefully over time we sort of get a bit of a equilibrium about that. So about 4 years ago when I went to the ACT, we got around the table with all the emergency services and said, look, clearly there's a problem here with the community. You're still not trusted, and all the advice I got when I got there was, why did you take on this gig? It was quite interesting. Why do you want to do this job? And I actually asked myself the same question after a week, and I think Dominic's asking himself the same question now. He's one of Rob's and my ex-colleagues, also current colleagues, but ex-RFS people. And it was a big challenge. And we said, look, we've got to get this thing back. We've got to get this thing back to some level playing field in the community because they're clearly not happy, and they're worried about the next fire. They're very worried about the next fire coming out. So we set our vision and we set our mission, and the mission was literal and analogous, if you like. So the fact that when someone calls 000 or 132 500 for SES, they are actually doing that because they're having a bad day, and they do call us because they have trusting confidence in us that we'll do everything we can to make their day a better day. The vast majority of circumstances we can succeed. Sometimes we don't, but it's our mission to always try. And I'll challenge anyone, any volunteer or career officer in emergency services, that please don't ever forget that, because when the call goes out, when the smoke goes up and the call goes out, people are putting their trust and confidence in you. And that is absolutely fundamental to RFS culture. And I used to talk about this before I left when I was head of strategy about how important trust was. And I think you have a high trust organisation. You would not have got through this summer as well as you did if you weren't trusted, and if you didn't trust yourselves. I mean, I think you're riding high at the moment, I've got to say. I think you're on the way to success. Just try and stay out of the trough. That's the challenge. How do you stay on top of the wave? I mean, that's the big challenge for any organisation. But clearly what you did this summer shows that the community does have trust and confidence in your organisation. So you've really got to hold on to that. Look, to the Canberra fires, I'm doing some work with ethics at the moment, actually, and I looked at the Canberra fires from an ethical perspective, and these are some of the things I guess we've noticed, and there's been a bit of a journey from the Canberra fires right through the fires of this summer across the nation, but we've come to understand, and they're really hard lessons, of the limitation of our conventional capability. And what I mean by that is the limitations of fire trucks and helicopters under certain conditions, and Rob showed some very powerful images of where you simply wouldn't put fire trucks. Just look at that fire in Coonabarabran. I think from memory, Rob, we had a number of conversations that night and on that afternoon, but helicopters had to put down and fire trucks had to get out of the way, and everyone had to get out of the way of the path of that fire because nothing was going to stop it. Well, it was no different in Canberra. The only problem was that the industry in 2003 had a bit of an arrogance about it that it could stop things like that, and it actually used to promote the fact that that we could take on that sort of natural phenomenon. That's simply not true. We can't do that. So there was I guess there was a confidence in Canberra that that they were on top of everything and they could deal with everything, and then of course it unfolded in a way that no one expected, and we were found wanting as an industry. And I don't think in 2003 we really understood the limitation of our conventional capability. I just don't think we really understood that. See the photo at the top left. That's the fire tornado that ripped through Canberra. This one up here. I've actually got some video footage of that. It's just been released. They finally released copyright on that thing. That was generating winds of about 350 kilometres an hour as it went into the suburbs of Canberra. Now, nobody could have forecast that. I don't care what anyone says about, we knew that thing was going to happen. That's arrogant. No, we had never proved or seen in any substantial way fire tornadoes. And I'm not talking about the things that come up off the ground. I'm talking about things that come down from a thunderstorm head. So if you look at the pyroconvective cloud in the photo below it, that was effectively the storm head that was creating the tornado underneath it that went into Canberra. Now, I've got no doubt that there was probably one of those in the Coonabarabran fire. We didn't capture it, but if you looked at that pyroconvective cloud, what was happening under it, there would have to have been tornado strength winds in that event as well. So we're learning more about the phenomena that we're dealing with, and this thing is getting worse, not better. It's getting more intense. So we've sort of got to swallow again the pill of humility and say, well, actually we don't understand all that goes on with these fires. Rick McRae, who works in the ACT in the ESA, has spent 10 years of his life committing his scientific knowledge to understanding what happened in this fire. And he started to publish his papers about fire tornadoes and high-risk fire in this sort of country. If you've got the time and you've got the inclination to read those sort of papers, look him up. It's fascinating research. There was deep division between state and territory, between New South Wales and the ACT back in 2003. I think that's just the way it was. It's much, much better now, but you saw that play out in the court. You saw that play out in the Crown inquest. So, there's things to learn there, and again, I come back to this notion of humility, and that exists right up to government level. And the no understanding of public messaging, I've got to say. When that fire hit Canberra on the afternoon of the 8th of January, they actually closed the doors on the media. They shut the doors and locked them out because they didn't know how to deal with it. They just didn't know how to deal with it. So there was no social media in those days, and we used to deal with media through press releases and press conferences and things like that. We didn't issue warnings, we didn't have warning systems, we didn't have any of the stuff we've got now. So I always say to people, when I talk about this fire, you've got to understand and remember that those people, like the rest of us, were actually doing the best they could with what they knew at the time. Does that make sense? So we can all sit back now and say they should have done this and they should have done that, but the reality is, the motivation of everybody in that circumstance, right from the Chief Minister down to the firefighter and everything else in between, was to do the best they could with what they knew. You should never ever forget that. Society should never forget that, because we keep steering off into blame culture and trying to blame people for things after an event. But find me a person who wasn't trying to do the best they could on the day. We all have a limitation, and that's what these natural disasters tend to teach, is that we all have a limitation. The sooner we understand that, the sooner we can move past it. So there was a very interesting statement that John Stanhope was told by one of the senior commanders in Canberra sometime after the fire. And he said, and Stanhope told me this not long after I got there, he said, "John, that fire went beyond my knowledge, anything I'd ever learned. It went beyond my skills, anything I'd ever acquired. It went beyond my experience, anything I'd ever have been through before." He said, "But this is what really killed me." He said, "It went beyond my imagination." And he said, once it went beyond that, he said, "I didn't know what to do." He said, "I actually didn't know what to do." And you can't hold a man personally to account and blame him when something goes beyond those realms. So if it's gone beyond something you've learned about, or been taught, or picked up, or you could possibly even imagine, then yes, there's probably space for learning, there's space for regret, there's all those emotions that you'll feel, but is it fair to blame someone for that? And the answer is no, it's not. And the lesson that it teaches, I think it teaches, is that, you know, and we'll all be faced with this in communities, and, you know, Rob's been faced with it, I've been faced with it, and I'm sure you've all been faced with it in your lives in the fire space, but you probably get faced with this almost every day in your life, except the consequences are so small you don't notice. But if we can pull together and unify as a community, as an organisation, as a government, then you tend to develop a collective wisdom about how to deal with these problems. So this principle of unity and pulling together is so critical in the face of things like this. So critical. If you don't do it, we will be found wanting. And natural disasters demand unity. It's just one of the things they demand. You know, you can't afford to be not on the same page. You can't afford to be fragmented or disconnected between your political level, your ministry of government level, and your service level. You know, at some point, you've got to meet in the middle and deal with the thing that's happening, because this thing's happening anyway. So, you know, we did a lot of things. I won't go through these because it's, you know, sort of management stuff, and you can get a feel for those yourself. But, you know, lots was done, but we won't really know whether the Canberra community is going to be happy with it until they get another big event. Now, interestingly, on the 18th of January this year, 10 years to the day, during the 10th year commemoration of the fires, of which many people didn't turn up because they're still really angry about it, the weather, the FDI in early afternoon hit 127. It hit catastrophic fire condition for about an hour and a half. And if you talk to Dom and to Andrew and the other guys who were at the memorial that morning, they had cold shivers. It was 34 degrees at 8 o'clock in the morning. They had cold shivers running down their spines, and they're sitting in their tunics in the sun at 9 o'clock 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock at the memorial, with cold shivers running down their spine, not because they were cold, but because what the weather was there. It was howling. It was coming in from the northwest, and it was just a filthy day. Now, ironically, about 5 days before, they had fires at the back of Canberra, out in the booty, so to speak, and this time they didn't run because they put them out and they got in early and they worked really hard on them to contain them. If you know the story about the Canberra fire, it was burning 10 days prior to it running into the city. So I think they actually did learn something. I think they got a result, but the ultimate irony was no one noticed. And that's the sad part, that the Canberra community didn't notice. The fact they had fire on their doorstep 10 years later, not dissimilar circumstances, not dissimilar weather, except this time nothing happened. And that's probably the greatest measure of success, except nobody noticed. And you know, there's the irony. That's the business that we're in. So I think they did learn something, and I think they've sort of got out the other end. But geez, it's been a hard road. It's been a hard road. I just want to talk about risk and then move to the Victorian bushfires, because I think between the Canberra fire and the Victorian fire, I don't know that we learned a lot, to be quite honest. I think because the Canberra fire got bogged down in a bit of legal dispute and all sorts of other things, I think we missed an opportunity to learn. I really do. You know, again, Rob and I and Shane, we used to talk about this from time to time about, you know, what really happened in Canberra and what was going on. It was all this legal stuff, and you know, some wish to pursue that. Because, you know, I make no judgment about that. I'm not sure that there's a fruitful outcome, but if those who wish to pursue it may pursue it. But let me put this proposition to you that, you know, we're all in the business of risk. Okay, so you know, you've got hazards, so you've got, you know, bushfire fuel, and you get weather, and you know, we all know about risk, and we treat it. So we treat it through, you know, dollars, time, resources, commitment, awareness, whatever. So we have an untreated risk. We're getting better at recognising what that needs to be treated with things. We're under a lot of pressure in that space with money and resources and volunteer time and effort. So there's a lot of pressure there, but we treat it. But you can't negate it. You can't say there won't be a bushfire. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah, but let's explore that just a little bit further. That's what we call the space of residual risk. Now, how much of us often talk about residual risk and how we plan for residual risk? And I don't think as an industry we do enough of it. So I think we do have a lot of conversations in treating risk, and there's a lot of debate about hazard reduction, a lot of debate about all sorts of other things. But there's a bit of an arrogance in that space because it implies or assumes that there won't be a bushfire. And that's not true. And in fact, again, that's arrogant. It's arrogant for us to say there won't be a bushfire. It truly is. And as a society, we've been struggling with this since we almost put our feet on this planet, God knows how many millennia ago, of man versus nature. But it's still pervading today. So we hear people, have heard people in the past, particularly at the political level, say, we need to make sure that thing never happens again. Well, with respect, that's not ours to choose. So we don't get to choose catastrophic events, but we do get to choose how we prepare and respond to them and recover from them. But you don't get to choose the event. I think we need to get better at understanding that, because if you look at the landscape, and I'll show you Victoria in a minute, and you probably understand where I'm coming. Hopefully, you understand where I'm coming from. What part of inevitability didn't we see about Victoria? It's a really interesting case study. So if I look at the Victorian fires, again, never look at the words as in the choose, because it's not dissimilar to Canberra, I've got to tell you. The attributes for Canberra popped up again in Victoria. But Rob and Shane you went to Marysville, didn't you? You went, yeah, and Dom and I and Keith went to Marysville a couple of days either side of that. And I stood in Marysville about a week or so after the fire went through. And it was clearly an overwhelming experience. I mean, it was just, the place was just obliterated. I think 38 people died in that town that afternoon. But I stood there and thought to myself, well, what part of inevitability didn't we get here? Like, if you stood in that village, it was a small village, a timber cutter village in the middle of a forest of heavily old age timber. Had been there over 100 years. The road up to the village was about 15 k's long through a literal forest. It had trees literally each side of the road all the way up. The cottages were all timber. It was at the top of the hill. It was in the sea of the forest. Victoria had been under drought stress for 10 years. And then we had catastrophic fire weather condition forecast 5 days out. So all of that, so we actually sort of individually or whatever knew all of that, yet somehow we didn't change our behaviour. So people went there that day to go to the spas and cafes and whatever, despite the fact that winds were blowing over 100 k's from the north. The temperature was in excess of 40 degrees, the humidity was about 3%, and the FDI went over 200. Now, I put the proposition, what part of inevitability are we not getting here? As a society, what part of inevitability do we not get? And I think that we've got to take a good hard look at residual risk and a good hard look at how we deal with it and how we plan for it. And so what we've seen happen this summer is we're seeing a building picture. So if you go right back to 1939, the outcomes of successive coronial inquiries and parliamentary reviews and everything else constantly come up with the same themes since 1939. And there's a COAG report written in 2005 which actually maps out what those subject areas are. And it's typically community education, communications, insurance, government funding, and so it goes on. So they keep popping up. Yet we keep having to go through these catastrophic events and be surprised about them. So I'm sort of suggesting that perhaps we're looking in the wrong space. Now, you need to take the learning from recommendations, because if we don't, then we can be accused of being ignorant or arrogant. So we need to take what it is that we learn from these things, because they teach us a lot. But we've got to go one step further. And you've got to take the inevitability of the event, and then you've got to picture, using your imagination, what the next one's going to look like. You've got to get your head around that, because if you only implement the recommendations from 2009 and 2003, and the flood inquiry recommendations in Queensland of 2010-11, and you stop there, you've just fought the last fight. We've just fought the last flood, but you haven't prepared yourself for the next one. So you've taken the learning, you've stepped up, you've improved your organisation, but have you positioned it for the next event? And I'm saying no, I don't think we have. I don't think as an industry we have. And I think so. The challenge at the local level is, get around the table and really think about and use your imaginations about what the next catastrophic fire day might look like and how that might manifest in terms of fire condition. And then how would you deal with it? Does that make sense? Now, there's no point turning around blaming the government or Shane or Rob or the RFS for the things you don't have, because here's the crux of the issue. You'll never have enough. That's the whole point. The whole point is, in the worst day of the worst fire, conventional capability stops. It has a limitation. It stops, and the fire goes beyond it. So you've got to think about what are you going to do in the space between your conventional capability where that fire takes you. That's the challenge for the industry. And public information has helped us significantly in that space, I've got to say. When I went to Denali in Tassie, a couple of days after that fire went through, that was 25,000 hectares in one afternoon. It took out over 400 properties. It went down a very heavily populated tourist area. And if you've been to Tassie now on that south-eastern peninsula, that's where everybody goes in the summertime. Mike Brown, our colleague in Tassie, the Chief Fire Officer, made the number one priority of his commander's intent was to issue warnings, not to send fire trucks. Not sending fire trucks and fighting the fire was priority number 6, not priority number 1. So priority 1 was issue warnings and tell the public what was going on and to make sure people got out of the way, and people did. So we have started to learn about this experience, but I don't know that it's embedded learning, and I don't think that we fully yet understand the fact that fire trucks and helicopters stop at a certain point and there's a gap. There's a huge gap that we've got to fill up. So we've got to think about what that looks like and then how we're going to respond to that, and we can ignore it at our peril. So Victoria, in my view, was one of those classic case studies where, as an entire society, including the industry, including governments and everyone else, didn't look beyond what we already knew. And then the thing popped up, it manifested, and everybody got surprised by it. You don't have to look back too far to understand that all the indicators were there. Everything that we needed to know, nature told us. We just didn't read it. We just didn't listen, and we just didn't read it. So the next one's coming, without a doubt. We went through this summer an ordinary summer, no climate signature, no El Nino, no La Nina. In fact, for some reason the ocean's turned off. They still don't know why. It's hard to turn an ocean off because it's such a big body of water that takes so long to warm and so long to cool. But something happened in the oceans that switched them off very quickly. And we ended up breaking 123 weather records this summer across Australia, most of those in the heat space, with no climate signature. None at all. So there was no driver of the climate that broke all those records. It was just a hot Australian summer. It just happened to be the hottest on record. So you add the journey from I'd take the journey from 1939 right through to now, and I look at what's been happening, and I look at how we keep dealing with things, and then I look at the climate trends and the weather trends, and I say, well, what part are we not getting here? What part are we not listening to here? So you have to imagine what this thing's going to look like, because none of us have the experience. You can't turn around and blame anybody. None of us have the experience yet, but you do have to position yourselves for it. Now, I'm not trying to rev people up emotionally and say, forecast Armageddon. I'm not saying that. I'm simply saying that I really hope it never happens to you. But I, nor you, have the ability to choose it. Yet we just don't. We don't get the ability to choose it. We do get the ability to choose how we respond to it. It really started a lesson that's come out since, as I said, over a long period of time, but certainly from Canberra through to now. So look, in Victoria, essentially they kept doing things the same way, even though this thing was unfolding. So there was no interstate deployment, for example. We weren't asked to send resources to Victoria in anticipation of that day, even though that day was being forecast as being the worst on record. There was no interstate mobilisation of resource. Now, could it have had an effect? Yes. Could it have stopped the event? No. But was Australia's resource optimised? No, it wasn't. It wasn't optimised. So there were other resources that could have been sent that weren't. Now, again, because we weren't thinking in that space, we didn't act on it. We didn't actually mobilise resources in Victoria that we could have mobilised. Something to think about for your local area. Just look in that dire and ugly. Have a think about what you've currently got. Is there anywhere else you can get it from if you need it? Do you know what I mean? They're the sort of lessons that come out of this sort of thing. So because we think on a risk-based approach, we tend to convince ourselves that things are going to be okay, but we can't guarantee it. So there's a bit of a statement there about, and it just, in the end of it, it gets to the fact that, we've got to use our knowledge, skills and experience, but you've got to use your imagination as well, and you've got to use your collective imagination to work out what it's going to look like and how we're going to do it. Never looked at the slides, a lot of words there. I'll give you an example of failure now. I'll move out of the bushfire space. I'll show you the fire in a minute. But anyway, there's a notion in society at the moment that failure is not an option. So if you listen to the economic debates, we can't accept failure. We've got to continue to grow. We've got to continue to increase our economic base, and so it goes on. That's largely because Western economics is based on growth and population growth. So we need more people to buy more things to produce more products in order to make more money. And that's pretty much how the economy is here. problem is, whilst ever failure is not an option, it will be inevitable because you can't guarantee success. So we're in that space as well, in the bushfire space. We keep getting pushed higher and higher and harder to succeed, and we're not always going to win. We're dealing with a force of nature that we can't always get our head around. So we had a little fire in Canberra called the Mitchell Chemical Fire, and that's 500,000 litres of oil on fire, and it contained PCBs, which effectively produces mustard gas when it's burnt. And that was you can see a vertical column there, but I think the next slide, have a look at the slide, the picture on the right, see the column bending over, that's just on dawn. There's a temperature inversion, so that smoke plume sitting over the top of about 80,000 feet. And at the time, we didn't know the concentrations of PCBs, and we didn't know whether phosgene was being produced. So that fire started about 11:30 at night, and by about 4 in the morning it took hold, the factory started to explode, the firefighters had to pull back, there was no active firefighting on the site, and that fire was doing whatever it wanted to do. So it wasn't a bushfire, but it's yet another one of these events that we didn't get to choose, and our conventional capability was useless. We just had to pull right back. So there's a few stats up there, just for those who are interested in type information. But at the end of the day, we put it out, nobody died, nobody was injured, and there's no environmental impact. So, a successful operation, you would argue. So if you saw those slides and saw the amount of fire that was there and smoke and toxic gas and everything else, and the fact that no one died, was injured, fire contained the building of origin and no environmental impact, you'd say, well, that's probably a fairly successful operation. So, glass half empty or glass half full? And this picks up on Rob's point about warnings. We issued the first warning, went really well because it was a small area, and we evacuated the suburb of Mitchell using the police and the fireys and got everybody out. That worked well, that's how we managed not to lose any lives. And then we sent out a second alert campaign, and that wasn't quite so successful. 16% of the numbers were answered and 80% of the numbers weren't dialed. So we launched a large campaign like Rob did in New South Wales, except that we didn't fully understand the system, and there's a default time in the system that, and it was defaults to half an hour. So if you don't change that, the system switches off after half an hour. We didn't realise that to publish such a large campaign would take about 7 hours. And so we published the campaign, we pushed it out to tell everybody to stay indoors and not to leave their homes. But there's this tiny little box in the system that had 30 minutes in it, and we didn't realise that the system switches off after 30 minutes because we weren't fully au fait with the system. So we went to publish the second campaign, and it switched off after 30 minutes, and most people didn't get the warning. So the community was ropeable, just ropeable, they didn't get a warning. So, despite the fact we'd been very successful in putting out the fire, when they found out that they hadn't been warned, or they could have been warned that something went wrong, they go back into us again and saying, why didn't you tell us? So this notion of keeping the public in touch is absolutely critical. Rob put up some very powerful statistics over the summer period in terms of what we've been telling people about fires, and that is the new world capability. That is the thing that replaces fire trucks and helicopters. It's the thing that mobilises individuals to do the thing they need to do themselves. So our lesson, well, we had to be very humble about it, I've got to tell you. We had to say to the community that we apologise for the failure of the second campaign. It was partly our fault, and we accepted that. It was also partly the system's fault, and a couple of other things. So, these things are never simple to solve. Never when we sit with one person, but, we did all of that, and we had to manage the politics between the Commonwealth and the territory government. So, something that we were well on top of things, and something that could go wrong really quick. And for us, it did. The warning system just didn't do what we thought it could do. We thought it could publish much quicker. We thought it could go out to a broader audience in a short period of time. We were going to find out that that's not actually the case. So when there was, and this didn't come out for about a week or so after the fire was over. But when that fire was, when it was burning, we were communicating to the public probably every hour and a half. We were telling, if you like, the unfolding story. And I'd say to any incident controller or person heading up a fire that you are a storyteller or a narrator as well as an incident controller. You have to tell the unfolding story. You have to tell the public everything you know and what's unfolding and what you want them to do about it. And we did that right through that fire, which is why I think initially we were seen as very successful by the public. And then on the Sunday night, so the fire started Thursday night, by Sunday night we had it out and we said to government, back to you, like we'll hand communications back to you. It's now a long-term recovery problem. They said, no problems, we'll pick up the messaging from Monday morning and we'll continue to talk to the public. The problem was that they didn't have their systems in place and they missed a day, so there was a day of silence in the public space. Well, the Tuesday morning there was a public meeting by all the business owners in Mitchell to talk about the fire and the fact some couldn't get back into their business. And so we went to the public meeting, the Chief Minister was there, the Minister and everybody else. Somebody got up and congratulated the Emergency Services Agency and the Fire Brigade for their efforts and said, brilliant job, put out the fire, nobody died, fantastic. Thank you to ESA for talking to us and keeping us in touch every step of the way, and we really appreciate the fact that you treated us like human beings. Then they turned to the government and got right into them because of that one day of silence, where there was no communication from emergency services and government, and they just hammered them because they felt like the government didn't care. It was palpable, and it was a very, very strong learning thing for me to realise how much people want to be connected into this space and how important it is for leaders, whether they're political leaders or operational leaders, make that emotional connection with the people you're protecting and treat them like people and talk to them like people. Don't talk at them, talk to them. And you have to genuinely care. You actually have to care. You can't say you're pretending you care. You have to care about those people and you've got to show that you care. It comes right back to the first slide of that trust. So the government learnt that and they've done lots of changes since to make sure there's never any gaps in what they're telling the public about what's unfolding. And it's important in the bushfire, it's important in this sort of stuff. So you've got to feed the information. You can't not do it. It's got to go out there and as much as you can put out, it needs to be put out to make sure people know what's going on. And as I said in Dunelly, because we did that in Dunelly, we saved many, many lives by telling people what was happening. I'll just finish off on this, and this is this issue around media. I don't think we'll get to the end of it because your lunch is out there and you've been sitting here all morning already. But 5 to 10 years ago, we were the masters of information. We used to deal with the media through press release or through phone contact. We ring them up and feed them information. But they could get feeds from elsewhere to a point, but it's only from what someone could say over the phone or from what they witnessed themselves. And then along comes social media and just blows that out of the water. So 5, 6, 7 years ago, we controlled the message through our 000 systems, through our radio networks, through brigades or whatever, and we pushed it out as we saw fit. And we were the masters of it. But that all changed, and when it changed, we were very much caught on the back foot. This is just a simple incident in Canberra. It was the Gungahlin Bridge collapse, which most of you know if you've driven into Canberra on the Barton Highway. The Gungahlin Road goes over the top, and they had to duplicate it. So the first bridge was there, then didn't build the road wide enough, they had to build another bridge. That's Canberra for you. And so in the middle of pouring that bridge, and it was a clear span construction, so there was no props under it, and traffic was driving under it, although I think they closed the lane that day for the concrete pour. And in the middle of the concrete pour, the bridge collapsed. It actually came down with workers on top. And we got the call to that at, what was the time called, 13:52, and our first rescue appliance was on scene at 13:59, but the media was on scene at 13:56, and they were streaming live from YouTube. And so they were actually filming us turning up. And if you look at that scene, it's complex. It is very complex. We didn't know if anyone was under it. We knew people on top of it, and they were covered in concrete, and they were trapped in their legs by the reinforcement and everything else, but we didn't know whether there were people underneath. And so we're having to do size up and try and work out what on earth is going on, and we're being filmed every step of the way on every move that we make. And the pressure on the guys on the ground was just enormous, just enormous. It turned out well, no one died. It was 15 injured, 4 critically, they survived. 9 is between severely injured to not too bad. But ironically, the slide in the middle, that's John Stanhope, who turned up as well, just to add a little bit of pressure to the scene. The Chief Minister of the day turns up as well. And so fortunately my media manager grabbed the Chief Minister and sort of took him off to the side and kept rigorously talking to him while we got on with the thing that we wanted to do. So the world has changed, and you're now on the truly global stage of social media. And whether you live in the country or the city, it won't matter. The Generation Y, the younger kids will have the capability. Somebody will be filming. If you saw the terrorist event in London this week, and that was all filmed. If you go online this morning on ABC, you'll see someone was filming from the roof when the police pulled up and shot the 2 assailants. I don't know if you've seen it, just go on the ABC News website. It's compelling stuff. So you see this, you literally see this assailant run towards a police car as the female police officer is opening the door. She hasn't realised he's coming, and the police officer in the back of the car has has seen it and drawn his pistol and shot him probably about 3 seconds before he got to the car door to start attacking the police officer. They didn't see the other assailant coming from a different direction until about 5 seconds after that, and then another officer drew his weapon and shot him as well. I mean, it's the most phenomenal footage to watch, and it's actually, there's no editing. There's somebody standing on the roof filming this thing as it's unfolding. Full credit to the police for how they dealt with it, because they just walked into a trap and they dealt with it really well. That's our world, ladies and gentlemen. That is now the world we live in. Media is instantaneous. They can film it from anywhere and they can publish it to the world. So all the stats you saw in Rob's presentation about millions and millions of page views, that's because the world is watching. That's not just coming from Sydney or coming from Melbourne or even Australia. The whole world is watching what you're doing. And that's enormous pressure. That's just phenomenal. But it is the world that we live in. But we dealt with it by, essentially dealt with it by doing all of those things. So social media is now well and truly embedded, and information is a big part of the ACT capability. It's a big part of what they do. Look, 2 minutes on politics, because I know that'll get you all revved up and I'll never get out of here, but anyway, politics is in fact a rational process, believe it or not. Yeah, I told you, I used to get upset, especially out here in Orange. Look, Nelson Mandela always said that the art of politics is finding the compromise without compromising the principle. So establish a principle and negotiate how you get there. And to a greater or lesser degree, I think Australian politics does follow that path. Sometimes it steers wayward. Sometimes it follows a narrow path. But you've all got a view about that, and I'm not going to debate you on that. But one of the things we found is with ministers, particularly, that they have an expectation of no surprises. That things are evidence-based, not based on speculation. That you've got evidence to support your proposal. That you give frank and fearless advice, but it's always within political context. And your ultimate measure is does this make sense? Is this a sensible outcome or not? And if you apply those principles in your political thinking, then hopefully you'll survive. Maybe not, I don't know, but it tends to work in Canberra so far. See how we go. So I just want a brief comment on that. In administrative government, the thing I found, particularly in Canberra, both at the federal level but also at the ACT level, that politics is alive and well in the public service. There's no doubt about that. No surprises to you guys. Very few understand command and control, and very few want to understand command and control. So if you try and talk to them through a command and control environment or narrative, you'll probably lose them very quickly. So some have to learn their language and how to work with them. It's not going away. They're embedded right across organisations. So we do need to engage them, and they do have great influence over ministerial decisions. And ironically, they do add value, believe it or not. There is value added. I've got to get right off the slide before I cause a riot. And in organisations, RFS doesn't matter where you go. Certainly like this in the ACT, there is insubordination amongst the ranks from time to time. Let's face it, sometimes that happens. I always say, find out who holds the real power, which is usually the secretary or executive assistant. They know everything about an organisation. And certainly in the career space, understand the human resource and industrial relations frameworks, but not so prevalent in the RFS. And look, I just wanted to finish off on this. I'm not going to talk about these in any great detail, but when we sort of talk in a leadership frame about everything we've just talked about today, and how do you get your mind prepared for something that you have no experience in, which is the crux of this whole presentation about how do you position yourself as a captain or a group captain, a fire control officer, a superintendent, a commissioner, it doesn't matter, for something you can't see coming. And I think we've seen enough of that today. And learning things like having mindfulness, always knowing where you're at emotionally, always knowing where you're at emotionally and accepting that emotion, not trying to fight it or push it off. Accepting what's happening, and as I said before, this notion about not accepting the catastrophic events unfolding is a really bad place to be in your mind, because it is happening, it is unfolding. The sooner you accept it, the sooner you get your head around it. Other things like having the humility to be able to say you don't know or you don't understand, and it's a big call for commissioners and deputy commissioners, director generals, incident controllers. It doesn't matter to stand in front of a camera, and I've had to do it in Canberra and say I don't know, I don't have the answer to that, but I'll go and find out. And so then you make your mission to go and find out and come back. But the industry is changing. It is learning humility. It is learning to say that actually we don't know it all. it is becoming more human, and because we're becoming more human, people can relate to us a lot better. So I think that's the pathway to not being so criticised in the future. If we show the human element and the fact that we have a vulnerability as well as everybody else, I think the criticism that will flow will be less. It's just my view, I don't know. I won't get through the rest of them other than say, and this is a great lesson for Canberra, the lesson of forgiveness. At some point in time, communities that are aggrieved by natural disaster events and blame people have to learn to forgive. Yeah, they have to put it down. And if they don't put it down, they're not in a position to be ready for the next one, because the next one's coming. You can't say it won't happen, because we don't control it. And in Canberra, it was palpable how some people after 10 years had not forgiven emergency services or the government or their neighbour or whatever, and were still as bitter and angry 10 years later as they were the day that fire started. Now, ironically, if we had gone and visited their house, I'm sure we could have written down at least 10 things that were wrong with the place before the fire hit. If I was going to be really honest about it. So this notion of lack of humility, it's fine for someone to point a finger and say, you're to blame, but as that famous saying goes, for every finger pointing forward, there's 3 fingers pointing back. And that's a societal problem. And society develops a greater humility about these events and understands their inevitability, then perhaps everybody will start changing the way they deal with them. There won't be so much discounting on it, there'll be more self-reflection as people getting ready for it. So the notion of forgiveness, which is an ethical notion, is something we've just got to explore as an industry and as a service in the community, to let people be freed up from the last event and they're angry about it and get ready for the next one. Because it's on its way. That's all I can say about that. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for the opportunity to come and talk today. I hope it's been a little insightful, and it's based on a bit of personal experience, and I guess some of the work in attorney journals we're starting to touch on. It's very, very early days about how to deal with inevitability, but we are starting to talk about it and pushing it out there and trying to get people to think a little bit differently about the hazard space. So I wish you well for the rest of your today's conference, and thanks to Dave for inviting me up, and it's nice to see you all yet again. Thanks very much.